worked in the, broadly speaking, philanthropic fundraising world, first at Brown University briefly, but then also at, then for a longer period of time at the Commonwealth Foundation in New York City, where he was a program officer and prepared, was in a key position to recommend or disrecommend various funding ideas for proposals. He subsequently went to the Dana Foundation, which is, I don't know if it was at the time, but it certainly became, while Walter was there, one of the premier medical research foundations. Walter ended up editing a journal called Cerebrum, which was a wonderful publication of advances in brain science written for intelligent lay people. I'm not sure even if they're still continuing to publish it. It's online now. In the course of that, Walter worked, I believe, directly under the late William Safire and continued to write extensively. So Walter, I think, has a fascinating topic, how you function in that predominantly liberal to left environment as an objectivist. So Walter, please join us. And
well, I had intended this talk, as I think now, I had intended this talk mainly for students who might be entering their careers and might want a few very simple tips on how to promote objectivism in a foundation. So to see Bob Poole, who started a foundation in a major magazine here, makes me think, maybe we should slightly switch gears. And when this gets published, as I hope it will, you could give me more suggestions to put in here, so when it finally does reach all those students, it'll be better, because I don't think you need, any of you here, most of you here, need tips on how to promote objectivism, but there are some students here, and maybe you'll benefit from it. When I traveled from Providence, Rhode Island to New York City for a job interview at the Commonwealth Fund, I first met with a guy who was actually going to hire me, or my immediate boss, and then when he was satisfied, he kind of gave me a little push into a huge office where the president and vice president were waiting to approve me or not approve me. It was a brief interview, but I managed to mention that I was somewhat a conservative. It wasn't true. I perfectly well knew my position on conservatism, but back then I felt it was the only shorthand that I could, that worked. I would never do it today. It's much more effective when talking to a so-called liberal to say you oppose conservatism, but also disagree with what most of the liberal, who's actually an advocate of the interventionist welfare state, thinks also, and then hope the question comes up, so what do you believe? Oh, I'll tell you. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to come out of the closet in that interview, albeit I came out wearing the wrong garment. I think because I was nervous, anxious about running into conflict in the job. Maybe I was trying to clear myself in advance. But whatever it was my hang-up. No one had asked. At any rate, the senior vice president, Robert Glazer, who had been the dean of the Stanford Medical School, said, well, we're all liberals here. Do you think that'll be a problem? Maybe I shouldn't have started this story, because I'm sorry, but I forget what I replied. Perhaps having had the spasm of obligatory frankness, if that's what it was, I felt I could drop the subject. The point is, they were all liberals, self-identified. They were all liberals, self-identified, and my topic is how I worked as an objectivist in liberal left institutions. I don't think I ever asked myself explicitly back then how to use my position, my jobs, in liberal institutions to advance objectivist ideas. In fact, that question, when I first proposed that talk, I was a little chagrined to realize that I had never raised the question with myself at the time. I think what I can offer as an explanation is it never occurred to me that I would do anything but advance objectivism. So if a purpose lies at the root of your intellectual life, perhaps you don't tend to ask can I pursue that purpose here and how? Because you're always pursuing it. Notice, though, I didn't say at the root of your life, but at the root of your intellectual life. Because literally to live to advance objectivism in the world would be inconsistent with objectivism. You work to propagate objectivism, I believe, in order to bring about the kind of world where you and those you love can thrive and find happiness. Your purpose is to live in the homeland of your soul, and your happiness is your purpose. I read Atlas Shrugged this summer before I headed off to Brown University, so in a sense, my first job was to get through college as an objectivist, and that was useful because I had enough run-ins over objectivism in college to begin to get real about what to expect when broaching the subject and discussing it. Also, and this is a big theme today, I started writing about objectivism and applying objectivist ideas to history, literature, philosophy, every field I studied. And by the way, it didn't necessarily do my grades any good. I did okay, I graduated with honors, but there were distinctly some papers, like my psychological analysis of everything FDR did in terms of a term I introduced into the paper, social metaphysics, which I described. I think I got a C+ because it was probably very well written, but he must have wondered. And you know, I would never do that today because I would realize that you have to start where your audience is. And in one paper, which probably the professor didn't read, but a grad student, to make the leap to, I'm going to do psychohistory, I'm going to use a new philosophy, I'm going to use social metaphysics, you know, I'm going to a bridge too far, maybe in a very, very long book. But anyway, I began to write, and the burden of this talk could be master the art of writing, and you can advance objectivism. Most of my career was not professionally as a writer, although I had tended it to be. I ran grant programs for two major New York City foundations, notorious bastions of liberalism, although it's now more often called progressivism because people have begun to tumble to the fact of what liberalism actually means. They call themselves progressivists mostly. Both of them, the Commonwealth Fund and the Dana Foundation, made their grants in the field of health, medical care services, medical education, medical research, public education about health. The Dana Foundation also made grants in education. Then at one point decided to put all of its chips on neuroscience and devote almost all of its money, not really to research, a lot of it, but to public education about the brain health, and particularly why the people ought, but the government too, ought to support brain research. I could have done these jobs without being a highly skilled professional level writer. My colleagues weren't, but most of what I did to advance objectivism would not have been possible, either within the foundation, using the foundation as a credential to publish, or outside of it, without writing. So right here is an indispensable second theme, closely related to writing, and that was generating applications and innovations arising from objectivist ideas. By the way, in this presentation, I will inevitably be referring to those applications and innovations of ideas as ideas, so don't get confused. We're talking about two different levels here. I suggest to you that these two, writing and creating applications and innovations based on objectivism, are virtually inseparable. Perhaps that's not so true, say, in science and business, although I'll probably hear an earful about that, but they are inseparable in a world like professionally managed foundations where ideas are at a premium. David Kelly yesterday talked about what the mission of your organization is. You know, you have a role in your life for being there, but it's also its life, its mission, and the life of foundations is ideas that are supposed to be programs that are implemented effectively. It's by writing that always by writing that I hit upon and evolve those ideas, because there's no intellectual discipline, no tool for thinking to compare with writing. And the creation of an idea by putting it into words becomes the essential first step in selling it to your colleagues, to your boss, to the board of directors and then later selling it to the public and the media. It just all goes together. The Dana Foundation's chairman, David Mahoney, had long wanted to have an awards program. These aren't grants, these are like prizes or awards. Big party, himself as MC, everybody in tuxedos or gowns, meeting and handing out money to important people. I think the Dana staff had passively resisted the idea for years because they saw it just that way. But when I heard him express his wish, I went back to my desk and literally started writing. I described a program that would make awards to individuals in the health area who came up with important new innovations, specifically new ideas. We call them pioneering achievements, foundation sales, but they were innovative ideas because I realized that ideas are the motor of progress in medicine as in every other area, and an idea is an asset that can be shared potentially infinitely, which is without further cost, which is certainly something the medical field was going to need. I also realized that the biggest obstacle faced by an innovator is to gain recognition of a new idea. So I proposed awards that had a purpose: the dinner, the crowd, the chairman's remarks. This, plus the publicity campaign with press releases, interviews with reporters, and follow-up publications, would have the goal of bringing the idea to the public and professional attention. A mechanism for nominations was set up, and nominations and selections was set up, and it worked, I think, because we could afford to do it right. The award to the individual at the grand party was $50,000. That was a prize, not a grant. Just, we really appreciate your having come up with this idea, and in addition to a handshake, we'd like to give you $50,000. So that got the press there, because we gave 5 of them. And it certainly made sure that the potential awardees didn't say, I'm too busy to arrive on that date. No one ever did. Dana made many awards over the years, both in health and education. I initially resisted adding education, thinking, oh, Lord, who's going to select those and by what criteria? But some turned out to be excellent, including one to a young mathematician, professor at Berkeley, who figured out a way for students to actually learn calculus. He did it by observing how the Chinese students on campus studied and unfailingly passed the course, and by adapting that to Anglos, so to speak, particularly minority students in this country, he reached a point where you didn't have to arrive at college as a math whiz to get through the course and not flunk. And all the medical students, all the pre-meds who came in hoping to be a doctor didn't fail right there in calculus. And that was it, because you couldn't pass calculus, you couldn't go on. So there were some really good ones. I wish I had time to discuss them, because we chose dozens, and I wrote up. I was always the one to write up every one. In fact, the awards may not have worked so well if I hadn't been the one who also wrote them up for publicity material, because I wrote the chairman's remarks, I wrote the awards and newsletter, I wrote the press releases, I wrote the annual report reporting what we'd reported, and I got that job because I was the designated writer at Dana, and I could protect my concept during implementation. It didn't get lost in implementation, it got reinforced. And that, again, is the importance of writing, the ideas. It just, the same process stemming from my commitment to objectivism and the perspective it gave me worked at the Commonwealth Fund. There was an outfit called National Medical Fellowships, which raised money to help mostly Black, Hispanic, and so-called minority students to get through medical school. The director came to Commonwealth one day and met with myself and the vice president, and he came to discuss extending the program from help to minority medical students to minority medical residents. As you know, residence is the specialty study after you've got your MD degree. So the director was a young Black guy himself. He's very bright and energetic. And I listened to him propose fellowships in support of medical school graduates who had demonstrated social conscience. The idea was that they would be specially trained to serve the needy of their minority. And that would make the fellowships useful, right? And that's why the Commonwealth Fund ought to support them, right? And I could almost hear those implied comments. Well, I could see our vice president, who's a perfectly good liberal up to a point, but is an amazing thinker about programs. He had no enthusiasm. It's true the very specific idea was new, to specifically train conscience-tested Black and Hispanic MDs in a way so they could be most effective going back to their communities to provide and organize medical care. But it sounded as though it had existed since Moses, because the premise of service to underserved groups and the self-sacrificing professional was so old and worn. It seemed like a good chance to inject some excitement. Another word for that's reality. I said, I don't see why these kids who actually make it to medical school and get through, often with the greatest financial struggle and the greatest obstacles, should now be told that the thing to do is to prepare for social service, that they're the ones who have to serve impoverished areas because they came from them. Many students, AKA white students, who get through medical school are interested more in science, and they want to combine medical care with research. And they're the ones with all the prestige, and they teach the next generation in medical schools. Why shouldn't minority students get a shot at that? Let's make this a program for post-medical school research training. Yeah, select them on minorities. That's what your program's about. Yes, go ahead. And you get selected based on your academic record in science, period. No interviews for social conscience. And sure, reserve them for minorities. That's the organization. And if there is a role in which there are very few students, minority students, in medicine, it is in research and teaching. There's actually if you want to look at it that way, a shortage. And I actually said just about this and no more. The director of the National Medical Fellowships looked very worried at first, cautious. He knew who was senior and who was cautious, and I wasn't. It was the vice president, to say the least. But by the end of the pitch, the senior vice president was nodding his head vigorously and continuously. So the wary look turned into a big smile. The deal was done virtually on the spot, although I later had to write it up, make the presentation to directors, but the money flowed pretty soon. After the meeting, I walked the director of the program downstairs, and when we were alone, he seized my hand in both of his, shaking it, and there were tears in his eyes. He said, I never thought this would be possible. No one thinks this way. He might have just been glad to get a grant, but if so, the tears were an awfully nice touch. I don't think I have time for any more examples of using objectivist premises to generate innovative ideas. In this case, of course, we call them programs and sell them. But this is how I used objectivism, and I could tell many, many, many more stories, essentially on the same lines, because objectivism is all about new ideas. When I would hear a program initially proposed, first I would bristle at it, but after a moment I would slip into thinking, well, what if? And that's what happened with National Medical Fellowships, that's what happened with the awards. And I guess, neither of the two ideas that I helped to create were radical. What happened was that I refocused very general ideas for programs toward things that my objectivist values recognized as important. Not that they weren't innovation has an important role, and people recognize that, in medical research, but what I could do was channel the money toward the best of values, the best of things that were accepted, away from the worst, because of course the liberal left is always trying to get the money away from medical research and such and into social service, and awards are always trying to get it away from medical science research and innovation and ideas and education and into needy areas in the ghetto where there are schools that need it. So it was a matter of steering, nothing radical. Okay, of course I had many opportunities to select grantees that neither foundation would have found or chosen. I actually became director of the Dana Grants Program in Education for about a year, and we've been giving fellowships to liberal arts college faculty members on the belief that there weren't going to be enough of them. I dropped that and focused on earlier education. We had in New York, at the Manhattan Institute, the most innovative and hard-driving advocates of public school choice. My colleagues would not have discovered that particular grantee. And I did have to sell it, but as always, it was the writing. But another consideration arose, as it did constantly. It was not so tough to find potentially good ideas in education that were at least widely enough accepted, so the foundation said, yeah, we'll go for that. It probably would be better in social service, but we can go for that too. I knew that in addition, I had to find advocates of them who were charismatic, who understood perfectly well that they faced objections and opposition and were kind of happy warriors, because they did have enough leverage to get a hearing for almost anyone. But once at the table with my skeptical colleagues, only the grantee could carry the day. So the former New York City high school principals who ran the public school choice program at the Manhattan Institute already had persuaded teachers and principals into giving up the legal monopoly on students, so obviously they were charismatic. I had never before been excited about public education, and I assure you, but this excited me. And of course, vouchers lay in the future, but for ultra-liberal New York City, this was a step. This is a demonstration of the principle of choice and competition, and it was working. I don't know if it always would have worked, but when it started, it seemed to be working. All right, I have to move along to the only other topic I can cover. When I arrived at the Commonwealth Fund in 1971, Medicare and Medicaid were only half a decade old. Washington was infected with ideas for extending it to comprehensive national health insurance. And soon Washington was spewing forth ideas for the oh-so-surprising, unexpected cost overruns of Medicare. And a first attempt was a law that created professional service review organizations, which was the first approach to rationing, which was to get together the community, get together a panel of doctors who would judge the care each doctor provided and decide whether it was necessary or not. But most of the momentum was to carry through to government medical insurance, making it universal. I don't think I would have had a great passion for debating the politics of medical care, but I was inspired, as in so many other issues, by articles in the Objectivist, including one that just came out, Doctors in the Police State, by Leonard Peikoff. So for about a decade, I became a crusader against government's assault on private medical care. I could have done nothing, though, without being a writer. The Commonwealth Fund didn't concern itself with legislative proposals as such, but all my colleagues more or less favored government support. In fact, they kept mounting demonstration programs, arguing to the board, Bob knows about this, of directors that if they succeeded, government might pick up the idea and go national. And they tried, one HMOs, a lot of different. My approach had to be outside the foundation, but I had a crucial asset. When I wrote my articles analyzing government proposals, skeptically, to say the least, I was Walter Donway, program officer at the prestigious Commonwealth Fund. The articles, nevertheless, were radical enough to have to be published in Private Practice, which was the journal of the Congress of County Medical Societies, which Llewellyn Rockwell then had turned into the voice of the private practitioner and private sector. In Private Practice, I published articles on every major proposal for government intervention in medical care that came out of Washington for 15 years. I assembled a huge card file of statistics, quotes, ideas on the entire subject, much of the information gathered from publications that came across my desk at work, and also we were meeting every day with physicians, hospital directors, medical school faculty, staff of the National Institutes of Health, and other medical organizations, and reading between the lines or hearing information and anecdotes and statistics presented not necessarily from my point of view, I got huge amounts of ammunition. So all of it got expressed in article after article for Private Practice, Medical World News, letters to the New York Times, Human Events, good old Human Events. I would hear later that my ideas, statistics, analysis were picked up by staff of congressmen who opposed national health insurance and by lobbyists who lobbied. I'd be called by lobbyists who want to check things. And of course, not because of me, but because of all such opposition. It was many, many decades before another major government intervention in medical care would pass, but now one has. What was happening here was a synergy between what I learned at the Commonwealth Fund, the credential I gained by my position, my philosophical framework of objectivism, my writing ability, which I endlessly exercised and improved. I didn't just say, you know, I want to write as well as I can. It was always a major goal to increase it. And the more I did, the more everybody turned to me to write everything and to edit their stuff. In fact, one wag said, I haven't had this Walterized yet. When I joined the Dana Foundation, I had much more opportunity to pursue ideas through the foundation itself. I talked about that. Also, by that time, the Institute of Objectivist Studies was available, was started, and I was spending a lot of time writing in connection with that, editing, as David said, the iOS Journal. I was able to get the Institute of Objectivist Studies its first grant from foundations. In fact, one of the relatively few grants that we've ever gotten. I did this the same way I shaped and sold all the programs. Dana had awards for innovation in health and education, so I proposed that we make a grant to iOS. It's a think tank, after all. Oh, you haven't heard of it? Very specialized. To sponsor a series of talks about the nature of innovation, how it comes about, and how to encourage it. So we had the grant flowed, and iOS had its first series of lectures in New York. Remember back when we were? Well, I wish I had time to discuss other aspects. How are we doing, Tom? Yeah. Well, I wish that I had more time to discuss aspects, but there really is, you know, there's wide as the whole range of promulgating ideas through society and in different fields. I've stuck to what I did in liberal institutions with liberal colleagues. Some points I would have made with more time or at greater length. One is the influence I had in killing proposals and ideas. Because in a foundation, many ideas and proposals are submitted or arise, and declining them requires much less consensus building, if any, than taking an idea through the whole system up to including recommending it to the board. So stopping bad ideas is literally a daily chore and easy before a proposal gains adherence. In fact, the very efficient senior vice president at the Commonwealth Fund said, anybody can turn anything down on their own. So, but of course, only he could. Another is how I used objectivist premises when I edited Cerebrum, the quarterly journal of the Dana Foundation that David mentioned, to bring new ideas and research and applications in neuroscience to the public and other scientists, many, many other scientists. We did this at a very sophisticated and challenging level with articles on all the topics in the brain, brain diseases, psychology from the point of view of brain research, the philosophy of brain and mind. David wrote one excellent review of a book by John Searle that we published. The philosophy of and perspective of objectivism was really a surprisingly protean source of ideas and slants for articles, such as one tearing into the animal rights movement. For that, I helped the author clarify his definition and description of human rights so he could argue more effectively why animals didn't have rights. And in fact, the former head of the National Institutes of Health said in a side comment, because he was the co-author, this is the best explanation of human rights I've ever seen. And the article, thank you, Bob, was reprinted as the cover story of Reason magazine. Aside from selecting or shaping articles, topics for articles, though, I had to establish a premise, even a tone, of reason as the standard, reason as the primary business of science. Because, as many of you know, even into science, there's a huge latitude for introducing the irrational. And brain science is full of topics in areas such as the brain determining behavior, brain conditions such as attention deficit disorder, the criminal brain, that are really playgrounds for speculation. There's no such thing as cut and dried rational science. So having objectivism and just consistently applying it made a really big difference in the whole tone of our publication. There was rarely anything in it that that didn't at some point emphasize rigor in science, reason as the standard, logic, facts, proof, a lot of, when we were editing, we slept in a lot of epistemological goodies like that. A few final things, and then some questions. You know, all of us who are objectivists apply objectivist ideas every day in our jobs and professions. We practice virtues essential to success, as David was saying. We have a view of ourselves and why we work that makes the work rewarding. We have an exalted appreciation of productivity at every level. We have an explicit concept of justice that we apply in dealing with colleagues, clients, and customers. Today, I wasn't talking about that. David talked about that yesterday, but I want to acknowledge it. Today, I was talking about opportunities to express and apply objectivist ideas as such, as not as a guide to the way you act in a business, but as your product, to embed ideas in programs and advocate them by writing and publishing. Well, it had seemed to me I was presenting a kind of meager story because it's a narrow context and a few examples, but my ambition here is to start a conversation. And certainly during my whole career in foundations, I heard relatively little from my fellow objectivists about the actual strategies for fighting the good fight for ideas in liberal organizations. I could have done much more if I had had other interests. Let me give one humorous example. At Dana, shortly after I arrived, the president and I hired a new program officer in health. He's a young gay man, very good experience at the National Institutes of Health. At any rate, he rose rapidly through the ranks, and before I knew it, we had 6 gay or lesbian staff members in an organization of 15, and that doesn't count 2 who had succumbed to AIDS. I kind of abhor the principle he was implementing, though they're all great people. But I paid no attention to my point. I paid no attention to recruiting colleagues who were objectivists or otherwise, because I had my head down writing. And when I looked up again, I was surrounded by people who were gay or lesbian and tended to advocate certain, views in connection with that. Not all of them. I paid too little attention to the politics being practiced around me, but you can never afford the luxury of dismissing a matter that affects your future or your choices, your ambition, because politics practiced itself on me. Heads up, there's incoming. I should have had my head up. I would welcome a discussion of any of these topics. There's nothing whatsoever inconsistent with independence when we join others in a common cause. It's just to do it, as I said. We have to lift our head from the desks, and I did that too often. Nothing potentially brings a greater sense of realizing our potential, gaining control over our lives, and achieving dominion over this earth than our work. And far from excluding other areas of life, real productivity in any area becomes the anchor of everything else. In this pursuit, the philosophy of objectivism is an advantage I found of almost incalculable worth. We must keep learning more about how to use it because, we have the world to win.
I'd like to comment that for me, objectivism has been a philosophy that I try to live by, and I believe that in practicing that, in our rational approaches to things, brings one's integrity to the front. And in your case, that integrity showed in people's respect for you and their desire to have you follow and edit their work.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that is true. I think that there was a sense that whether they agreed with me, I had definite heartfelt ideas, that I was consistent, passionate about it, and that I was good at expressing this, and I could always understand what was being said, whether or not I agreed with it. And when I couldn't change it, I could always say it better. And I think that's a very good point.
I'm going to take a moderator's privilege here. First of all, to remind people, we do need to record it here because we're filming and to make this more widely available. So please do, if you have questions, come on over here. Walter, some of the things you described, particularly the, I think it was the National Institutes of Health for Minority
National
MDs,
Medical Fellowships. Yeah.
it reminded me of something I've sometimes seemed to notice, that when you have a coherent philosophy, it's a little bit like being the sighted man in the land of the blind, that you have a source of ideas that seem obvious coming from, but to others they're revelations. I mean, so I don't mean the broad philosophical abstractions. I mean, you see something just by applying a principle that you've always known to a situation, and it opens a path that doesn't seem hard to you, but is truly a revelation to other people. That just, wow, where'd you come up with that idea?
That is a point.
And
Yeah.
do you have other stories like that, or if anyone else does? This is something that I've seen frequently.
I can't immediately think, I mean, there are so many different stories. I think that in many cases I felt what I was doing was just common sense, but the reaction of people, like to the awards program, was a lot of excitement. So I think you're right on there, that in the context of my philosophy it seemed common sense, but outside that context it seemed innovative, and was on the scene.
Walter, you talked a lot about how your writing abilities sort of pushed you along and gave you a lot of leverage. Did you feel your writing abilities owed anything to objectivism, or do you think that was just your own native knack with words, perhaps?
Oh, did it owed anything to objectivism? Oh, I think it certainly did. I had started writing very early on and identified myself as a writer in the 8th grade and pursued it fairly relentlessly, very relentlessly, all my life. It would be almost, the amount that it owes to objectivism is huge. Of course, there's the content aspect of it, but I think the thing that most impressed me was the way, first, that Ayn Rand could make very, very strong-sounding statements, but when you came to understand them, you understood they were the exact truth, like the fascist New Frontier, or I mean, sometimes they were metaphorical. When she talked about the soft, safe assassins of the classroom, most of them weren't mowing down their students literally, but if assassination means to deliberately kill off something in order to promote a political or other point of view, then they were certainly an assassin of what we think of life-giving ideas. So I was inspired by that. I was also inspired by and have tried to make a specialty of the amount of moral passion she got into her statements. And early on, I used to criticize some of my colleagues, saying, well, you're saying all the right things, et cetera, but you don't sound like Ayn Rand. Everything she said, was on fire, but you don't. And they had very good answers like, yes, well, my focus now is to be accurate and to be true and to be integrated. Maybe when I gain much, much more certainty about my ideas, I'll become more fiery. And I think that makes sense. On the other hand, I don't see anywhere in our movement today the kind of huge moral fire that she seemed to bring to the cause that made people feel that if they weren't pursuing it, that they were missing something of absolutely life-giving importance. It was a life and death matter to understand these ideas, and if they didn't, they just had to accept the risk. I don't see that fire and feel that fire. I'm not quite sure why, but that's something I always wanted to try to imitate. And sometimes my fiction writing abilities helped in that. So,
Walter, I wanted to thank you for being a wonderful example of someone who applies your principles in your daily life to help create the world that you want to live in, as opposed to thinking you have to go save the world before you can live the way you want to, but just actually living every day, applying those ideas. And by doing that, you've not only created a better world for yourself, but then you've also, of course, helped all the rest of us who share those same principles, which is a lovely side effect. But the important thing is that you applied those ideas yourself every day. And I thank you for being a great example of that.
Oh, thank you very, very much. I don't think I could have forged on through. I got into foundations to support my creative writing career. It did support it, but it also supplanted it to a degree. Although, as I've said, I did a great deal at the time. I don't think I could have slogged through foundations, which tend to be slightly boring as they're set up. I don't think I could have slogged through without the excitement of constantly referring everything to my ideas in objectivism. I just don't think I'd have stayed.
Walter, you worked in the universe of philanthropy in New York for your career, so you know you knew that world, not just the two institutions where you worked, but many others, I'm sure. Do you still have a sense of where there are opportunities that at institutions like Dana or Commonwealth Fund or any of the other places for people who might be interested in getting into that world?
One thing I realized at some point later in my career was that I didn't know as much about other foundations as I could or should. I wasn't networking. My colleagues were networking and getting offers. I kind of had my head down too much. And people would ask me about other foundations. Of course, I did go to conferences. I did know about other foundations, certainly to an extent. But I didn't get the insider's view that many of my colleagues did, who considered themselves a foundation up-and-coming professional and were networking like crazy. I didn't do that. I didn't make the visits to the other foundations. Again, it's relatively, but, and I don't really know enough today to say. I do have the impression that there are more foundations today in our area, more foundations today supporting, if not libertarian causes, at least good economic causes and such. Some of them aren't foundations, they're think tanks. There's certainly a lot more than there was when I was starting out. So I think a little research would indicate that there might be foundations where you could go where you'd have much even better opportunity because you would be with somewhat like-minded people. A lot more opportunities. I mean, Cato, I don't think existed when I started out, or Heritage. I don't think the Heartland Institute did. The Reason Foundation, grew and developed and flourished during my time in foundations. I think there's a lot more out there, but can't really be specific. Thank you.